Hey. Huh? Right. No, well, I'm just trying to get somebody's attention. Right. There he goes. All right. Well, good morning, friends. It's good to see you today. I would just at this point call you, just the old faithful. Still plugging away on Thursday morning on this gloomy, misty morning. It's good to be with you, and I'm excited to keep plugging along through our story. So let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we acknowledge your presence among us today. And as we have said before, it is often easy to not be mindful or to pay attention to your presence among us. But we pause in this moment to say, you are here. You are here among us. Even as we wipe the sleep from our eyes and come together to learn, Lord, we invite you to have your way among us. Open our hearts and our minds. Give us the courage to think deeply, to engage fully, in order that your Spirit might transform us. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, let's continue our story this morning with God's rescue operation, bringing his beloved back to himself. And now we have a baby. Hooray! Baby Isaac finally makes the scene. The child of the promise has finally arrived, and laughter abounds at the wonder of God's promise. And if you've ever waited for a kid, whether it's through infertility or through adoption, or frankly just been pregnant and thought, like, this is my life now. I will never have this baby, and this is my new forever, right? And you felt that when you were pregnant, right? It's finally here, and there's such relief. And like you think you were tired getting up with a newborn 10 times a night? Imagine that when you're 90, Like, you can't complain. You were 27. You're fine, right? But nothing, not even newborn fatigue or dark circles under their eyes, can dampen the joy of Sarah and Abraham. It's a beautiful, beautiful scene. But even as Sarah is snuggling that newborn and nursing and nurturing him, she looks out the nursery window, and what does she see but Ishmael? The child of her disobedience, the child of her lack of faith, the child born of rebellion and impatience, and Sarah is afraid. Where before she was afraid of that childless future, she now is afraid on behalf of her son and his rights. Like, is Ishmael going to usurp his inheritance, his position? Like, what could possibly happen? So we're going to start today in chapter 19, if you want to hop there, in verse 8. All right, chapter 19, here we go. The child, Isaac, grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So just brothers. Brothers are, roughhousing it in the dust out there. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. And the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to what? Is that the wrong chapter? Sorry. I don't know. Keep going a little bit. What is it? 21. My bad. Verse 8. That's where we started. So, but God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy, Ishmael, and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that the offspring shall be named. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning. He took bread and a skin of water, and he gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now, God's promise has proved true, and we're like, yay! And then we read this passage, and we're like, oh, That is bad. Isaac is here, but Abraham and Sarah's sin has lasting consequences. Yes, the promise has come true, but because they initiated that rogue plan B, there are real consequences that impact real people. The way I talk about this with my kids is that sin has a ripple effect. We think, okay, I've made a bad choice, I have sinned, and I'm going to make it right with God, and we move on. But here's the thing. When we sin, it is like throwing a rock in a pond, and the ripple effect impacts everybody around you. And so now Hagar and Ishmael are being tossed to and fro by the ripple effect of Abraham and Sarah's sin, okay? So in fear and anxiety and in jealousy for her son, Sarah acts in this unspeakably cruel way, banishing Hagar and Ishmael. And they're not even giving Hagar a name. They're just calling her the slave woman. Could there be anything more dehumanizing? And so they sent them out into the wilderness. Now, it's interesting how someone who has been shown such extraordinary generosity from God, who has been resurrected in a sense from barrenness and affliction, can now so quickly build a bunker of fear and self-protection and exclusion. It's funny how that works, right? You see, Sarah has just borne witness in a very literal way of God's mind-blowing faithfulness. A 90-year-old mom, like that is not a thing. But in God's economy, yes, indeed, it is a thing. She has stood by and watched God be nothing but faithful to her and her husband, in spite of the fact that she actively and intentionally rebelled against God's plan and fully went rogue, right? God was faithful to her even then. God's never-ending, never giving up, always and forever love is like that. So Sarah's response to God's generosity is her miserly, stingy, close-fisted hoarder behavior. She got hers. Now forget about everybody else, and you better lock that present or that promise up tight. Don't let anybody threaten it with their own claims. There's no room for anybody else. And so you can feel in this text, there is this palpable fear throbbing within her, a overwhelming sense of scarcity. Scarcity. It's almost as if she believes that God's promise is on a lean budget. So Sarah takes it upon herself, once again, going rogue, to defend the promise and to act like the ultimate gatekeeper to keep anybody out who might threaten the promise. So let's pause right there for some reflection, okay? Because this concept of scarcity versus abundance, of full trust versus buying into this lie of God being on a budget, like there is somehow a finite amount of God's faithfulness or God's promise. So let's pause, and we're going to skip the talk to your neighbor today because we were running out of time yesterday, and I'm taking my earrings off because they keep clicking it, and that's annoying. So let's look at your questions. Grab your paper, grab your pen. Why do you think Sarah, after receiving the blessing, acts out of such fear and self-protection? Why does she do that? And number two, how can fear tempt us as a community to exclude? These earrings are so cute, but they're so annoying, right? How can fear tempt a community to exclude others even after they have experienced God's generosity? So why would Sarah do such a thing? And then why do we also do such a thing? So I'll give you about a minute. Jot down your initial thoughts. And then I'll invite us to share as a group. I feel like we've built trust. We can share as a group, right? You should leave the baby in here because it gives us Isaac vibes during the talk. So why do you think? Why did Sarah, having received so much abundance, act out of such fear and self-protection? What's going on here within Sarah's heart? Yeah.
I wonder if yesterday, after waiting for so many years,
right?
Even though she's seen the promise, she still doesn't trust.
Right. So maybe she still doesn't trust. She's like, dude, 25 years of trauma, 25 years of waiting, of suffering, and you think one little promise is supposed to, like, Set me free from all that? Like, no, I still have questions about your behavior, God. Okay. Yeah, what about you? Okay. Okay. Right. That promise was so long in coming that I finally have received it, and nothing is going to pry it out of my white-knuckled grip. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So she's lived into that fear of scarcity for 25 years, and you don't just pivot on a dime sometimes, right? Yeah, it's become entrenched in her. Yeah, yeah. Right. This is that. I mean, there's not more children coming, right? Right. And so, like, this is, can you imagine? Like, one time Jack was in our backyard, like, play structure, and he was like 4, and I was talking to my mom, and all of a sudden he leaps off that thing. And I'm like, "Ugh!" And my mom was like, what happened? And it was Jack just free sailing off this, and he was fine. He tucked and rolled. It was fine. But can you imagine Sarah? Like Isaac trips and she's like, ugh, the promise has a skinned knee. What if it gets infected? Like imagine the pressure of that. That's such a valid thought. Yeah, you. Yeah. Right. 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 And there's a scarcity. That's scarcity mindset. Yes. Mm. Right. Yeah. Right. That is such a good point. If you didn't hear her in the back, she said, in this culture, women they were measured in value in a different way, primarily through their ability to procreate. And all of her life, Sarah has been put second place, Abraham making bad decisions to protect himself and putting her in harm's way by sending her off to Pharaoh, right? And so her whole life, she has had to work in these kind of devious ways to kind of achieve the goal, right? That's an excellent point. So let's transition now to ourselves. How can that kind of fear of scarcity in our community lead us to act in similar ways of excluding others? Yeah.
I think there's always that part of trust is not completely there.
Mm.
Something else could creep in and I wouldn't be able to.
Yeah. So in the same way that we think, okay, God was faithful, but like, is that the new norm? Or like we too maybe have been impacted or shaped into a spirit of distrust. And so it's hard to make it, like I said, make a pivot to a life of full trust, even as us, a community. Yeah, in the back. Okay. Okay. Ah. Right. Right. If you think about it, we have the benefit of the loaves and fishes, But you think about it, doing the math, more people comes in, does that mean there's less for me? Right? Does that mean I have to adjust how I operate in our congregation? Like you go from a place where like, I know everybody by name, everybody knows your name. And then all of a sudden all these new people come in and it changes the vibe. Yeah, okay, so a fear of change, right? Again, that fear of like scarcity and how that's going to readjust some things. Yeah, what about that right there? Okay, so we are looking at what we need through our lens of our needs, and that limits us from perhaps fully empathizing with the needs of others. Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So underneath some of these like bad behaviors, right, of selfishness and, like worrying about, are we going to get ours? Beneath that is actually like a pulsing fear, like an insecurity, like, am I going to have what I need? Am I enough? Like, is God going to see me or is he too busy over here? Yeah. Oh, that's a valid point. Like, okay, yeah, I trust God, but people come in here and people be crazy, right? So if I open myself up to that, that's going to change things, and people are messy. That is such a good point. Okay, let's keep going. Here's the thing when it comes to scarcity versus abundance of God, this idea that God, like I am, God is on a budget because there are finite resources. Here's the thing we forget. God's promise is never on a budget. God's promise is rich beyond measure, deep beyond comprehension. It is a wild river overflowing its banks. It is the sun that floods the earth with light. There is no scarcity in God's promise. So Sarah, in her fear and protection, anxiety and jealousy, she took that abundant promise and she perverted its nature by claiming it as a possession of her own. But as we have seen, like if you flip back to chapter 12, verse 3, the very nature of this promise was global. Remember in verse 3, what did it say? I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you, I will curse. And in you or through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So why was Abraham blessed? To be a blessing, right? The very nature of the gift was universal. The gift tag might have said Abraham and Sarah, but its contents were intended to be shared. So Isaac, yes, he was this precious gift to this one couple in history, but he was also a part of God's bigger plan for redemption. And yes, God has promised to bless Ishmael. Did you catch that? He said, yes, I know you're worried about Ishmael, but don't worry, I'm going to make him a great nation. But that's not at the expense of Isaac. The promise is not on a budget. God is making a way. Even over here, even as a result of sin, God will make a way because the blessing is not rationed. But Sarah, she's not buying it. And bless her heart, Abraham keeps getting to talk to God. He's getting these like nighttime tours. He's having all these encounters. And Sarah's just supposed to buy it from the dude who handed her over to Pharaoh. Like, I feel some compassion there. I'm like, could I come to this meeting with the Lord, because she's not buying it. She is controlled by fear and the need to protect the gift instead of trusting the gift giver, okay? She's fixated on protecting the gift instead of trusting the gift giver. And so, unfortunately, Sarah's arrogant exclusivism sets the tone for her descendants, right? For the nation of Israel. Now think through the Old Testament with me for a second. It shows time and time again that Israel, the bearers of God's promise to bless the world, are the worst stewards ever, right? Instead of embodying God's way of living in order to invite others to the table and the blessing, they basked in the blessing and they didn't want anybody to corrupt it or to corrupt them. Think of all the ways that they excluded others. And they ended up oppressing the poor and neglecting justice and acting as gatekeepers to God's promise. Now think for a second with me all the way to Acts chapter 10. Peter has the vision of like the sheet with the animals, and then he's supposed to go over to Cornelius' house, and he's like, hard pass. And God says, don't call anything unclean that I have called clean. Right? And so way back here, they're already like unclean, 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 right? Don't corrupt the promise. But what about Abraham in this whole process? If you look back to 21, 12 through 14, Abraham is not a fan of the plan. We've already read that. He's like, wait a second. He's my son too. Ishmael is my son. But Abraham goes along with it. God told him to. But in my heart, I'm thinking, dude, that really is your son. Ishmael, though, is the son that represents impatience and lack of trust in God as a future maker. And yet, even so, God works for the good. I remember in seminary, one of my professors, Roger Hahn, we were talking about that passage of God, works for the good of those who love him and are called into his purpose. And often we hear that and think, okay, well, everything happens for a reason, or God is doing this thing, and it was always meant to be. So I'm so glad I did that horrible thing, because look what God did. False, right? What Dr. Hahn used to say, he would say, from wherever you find yourself, God can work for the good. That was not God's best, and yet even God can work for the good. And so God is demonstrating that Ishmael is not excluded from God's goodness because of the sins of his father. So let's pause for a second. Ishmael is not excluded from God's goodness because of the sins of his father. What do we learn about God's character in the way that he acknowledges both Isaac and Ishmael? And how might we misrepresent God when we act like, that's not possible. This is a zero-sum game. It's a black and white situation, okay? So what do we learn about God's character? And how do we misrepresent God's character? Okay, so take a minute, jot it down. So what do you think? What do we learn about God's character in the way that he makes a way both for Ishmael and Isaac? What do we learn? Who's God showing himself to be? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Okay. So he said when we misrepresent God, we are in the same camp as those who don't, who need that desperately anyway, right? We are just as broken as those who we're supposed to be witnessing to. We're supposed to be representing God too, right? And what was that last part you said?
Our human error
Yeah.
gets in the way of what God is trying.
Okay, so our human error actually becomes a barrier to people coming to know God. Ooh, bummer. So what else? What does this reveal, the way he made a way for both, about God's character? Okay, one more. He's got another one. All right. Okay, so it reveals that even when we blow it big time, God, his power is not limited or like hogtied by our sin. It shows that God is persistent, God will make a way, and nothing that we can do will inhibit God's mission. Yes, yeah. Okay. Right, God does not show favoritism. God's love is for all, and all means all. Yeah, Aaron. Right. And Abraham doesn't even come to God and ask the question. Abraham was like, hey, could you maybe, bless Ishmael too? God has already made a way. God has seen and is making a way before we even ask. Yeah. Say that one more time. Before we call, I will answer. So, Isaiah 65:24, yeah. So speaking of that, we hear all these things about God's character, his persistence, his lack of favoritism, his abundance, his persistence. How do we sometimes misrepresent God? Misrepresent all those characteristics and how we navigate this tension? Are there ways that we misrepresent the character of God? Can you say that a little bit louder? Okay, so we are actually making God appear less than who he is. We are limiting people's ability to come to know God by misrepresenting him. Oh, man. Oof. Any other way? Misrepresenting? Yeah. Okay, so when we limit God or when we put these kind of boundaries over who God can be and what God can do, we also damage ourselves. If we're made in the image of God and yet we're putting these limits on them, it then reflects on limits on us, right? Okay, all right. And us to other people, yes. All right, so shame on them, right? Shame. So much complication because of the impatience and the lack of trust in God as the future maker. Just shame on them. Shame on Sarah, shame on Abraham, shame on your cow, all the things. Shame on your descendants. But, I do believe we are the pot calling the kettle black. Are we not? Because too often do we find ourselves, the church, playing the same game, having experienced the love and transformation of God, having been blessed beyond measure with God's gracious gift of salvation and healing and restoration and forgiveness and mercy and sanctification, we often turn into blessing hoarders. We lock up the promise and we ration out the blessing for fear that it will run out. Or maybe better stated, and I think this maybe will ring a little bit more true with us as holiness people. We are less afraid of the promise running out, and we are more afraid of it being corrupted, that it will be sullied. We have been given gift upon gift. And instead of distributing the love and acceptance and forgiveness, we take these gifts and we stack them against the door, prevent any riffraff from coming in, right? Lest they usurp our birthright or our status or somehow dirty what God is doing, dirty our commitment to the Lord, somehow damage our holiness. And interestingly enough, I have actually, when I was a pastor, and even when I was at a college chaplain, when I was at a local, at the local church level, I saw this a lot with parents, and not necessarily here, so calm down, but church members. They were so eager to be hospitable to the outsider and create space for them and bring people into the family of God, as rough and tumble as they were, until their kids became teenagers. And as their concern for their child would grow, almost without fail, parents would come to us and be like, I'm really concerned about those kids. The ones that come from bad homes, I'm really concerned. And usually it was kind of language around protection and for safety and all that. And I get it. I have kids. I too worry about JoJo and Jack's peers, especially since JoJo started middle school this past year. I was like, oh, but heaven forbid. We become so preoccupied with building this bunker and protecting my own interests that I lose sight of the mission to which I and we have been called, and to which my children have been called, right? Blessed to be a blessing, shown the light to share the light, not just saved from, but saved for something, right? Am I like Sarah, who was so fearful and so unsure of God's promises that I need to take the role of gatekeeper? God's, kind of letting in the riffraff, so I better step up, right? And become the gatekeeper. So what does that teach my babies about the mission of God and our call to join it? Yeah, God's called us to do this particular thing, but make sure you don't talk to that kid. And I get it. I totally get it. And we need to have discernment in how we protect and provide boundaries and guardrails for our children. But I remember sometimes as a teenager, we would talk about be a light, witness to people, do all this stuff. And then the next Wednesday, we'd be keep yourself separate from the world. And it's I feel like I'm getting mixed messages, right? And so sometimes we have that tension right there, and maybe we lean a little bit more towards that, separate ourselves from the world. But for all my critique of Sarah's behavior and Abraham's, there is something we need to consider. God went along with it. He's the one who sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness like lepers, like excommunicated criminals. Is God complicit in Sarah's oppression? Is God so concerned with the promise to Abraham and Sarah that even God wants to get Ishmael out of the way, that he would shoo them out to the wilderness? What are God's wilderness intentions for Hagar? It seems kind of cruel to send her out into the wilderness. But the wilderness is a pretty interesting place biblically, isn't it? Lots of stuff goes down with God's people in the wilderness. So what are some examples? Israel's wandering, 40 years. Israel's wandering. David in the wilderness, fleeing Saul. He spent a lot of time hiding in caves. Of course, Elijah from our lesson the other day, he fled to the wilderness, but it was in that place that he encountered God in such a transformative way. John the Baptist's ministry out in the wilderness, and even Jesus' temptation, the 40 days, that recapitulation, that re-experiencing the wilderness of Israel, but as Jesus, right, those 40 days. Crazy things happen in the wilderness. So let's pause for a second. Why do you think we are given so many transformational stories in Scripture? Why do so many of them happen in the wilderness? Why do so many stories of transformation take place in the wilderness? What is God doing? Okay, let's think about that for just a sec. Think through those stories. Why the wilderness? Why is that God's preferred setting for transformation? Why? Yeah. Humility, okay. Like you're brought pretty low when you're searching for water. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Right. Oh, wow, that's kind of cool. I like that. It's one of those things where she said, when you're in the wilderness, everything is stripped away. So the things that before were maybe a source of security or discomfort or distraction, all the things that serve that purpose are taken away. And now you got to rely on God for all the things. And second, there is nothing to distract you. And that is uncomfortable, right? And I sometimes think, with Israel in the 40 years, I think part of the length of that was their resistance to that transformation. Like that, and like, guys, just let God do it all this. We could resolve this. What else? Why does God choose the wilderness? Yeah. Okay. He says the wilderness often represents or brings us into seasons of trials and temptations and all these difficult things. But he cited James where it said, don't consider it joy when you go through those things because God's doing something in you. God is initiating a promise of change. So here's the thing. God's stuff happens in the wilderness. And the same is true of Hagar. We think God's rejecting her, but actually, if God's willing to bring her into the wilderness and bring about change in her life, it would seem to me that God counts her one of his people, right? God counts her as one of his children, so much so that he would give her her own wilderness experience. And we didn't talk about this last time, but this isn't Hagar's first rodeo in the wilderness, right? She's been banished before. When Hagar first got pregnant with Ishmael, and then she started kind of rubbing it in Sarah's face a little bit. Sarah had this conniption fit, and Hagar ran to the desert for fear of her life. And as she sat pregnant and abandoned and confused and scared, an angel of the Lord appeared to her in her distress. So time travel back with me for a second. Genesis 16, verse 10. The angel of the Lord said to Hagar, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. Have we heard that language before? Yeah. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son, and you shall call him Ishmael, for God has given heed to your affliction. So Hagar was supposed to name Ishmael, her son Ishmael, because it means the Lord hears. The Lord hears. The Lord has heard your cries. So Hagar stands up and she dusts herself off. And the text tells us that she then names the Lord, calls God El Roi, the living God who sees me. He is the God who hears Ishmael. He is the God who sees El Roi. But now it's Hagar with her young teenage boy getting shuffled off to the wilderness again. And I wonder what she's thinking. I thought this was going to work out, God. Is it still true? Is God still the one who hears? Is God still the one who sees? Because God's special people don't seem to care about me or my boy. They are so preoccupied with their own blessing that they have banished us in fear that it will be disrupted, it will be diminished, it will be corrupted by my very presence. Is there God like that too? Where is El Roi who sees me? Where is Ishmael, God who hears me? So let's read, starting at verse 21, verse 15. Am I in the right place this time? When the water in the skin was gone? Am I in the right spot? Now I'm questioning all my things. Okay. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat opposite from him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, and she said, Don't let me look upon the death of my child. I can't even watch. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and she filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt, her homeland. Hagar had given up on God as El Roi, the God who sees. She was no longer believing in Ishmael, the God who hears. She sits in anguish as her son is withering, and she has no expectation of a rescuer. Not again. Surely it won't happen again. It is interesting, having been unseen and unheard by the people of God, that Hagar translates that experience onto God. She wasn't seen. She wasn't heard. In fact, she was rejected and oppressed. And she begins to wonder, is God like that too? Because that's how his people are acting. It's almost as if people can come to trust God or not trust God based on how faithfully God's people represent God. Here's the thing. In spite of the misrepresentation of God's people to Hagar, in spite of their very poor their representation, their lack of representation, that basically a lie of how they are representing God to Hagar, God did see and God did hear. Even their poor representation cannot violate the character of God. So verse 17, God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel called to heaven, "What troubles you? What troubles you? Do not be afraid, for God has heard." So let's stop. Let's stop for there a second. God stuff happens in the wilderness. What does it say about God's nature that God would meet Hagar and Ishmael, these outsiders, again in the wilderness, even after their rejection by the chosen family? And I'm saying quotes not because they're not chosen, but because they're not acting like it. What does it say about God's nature that God would meet with these outsiders in the wilderness? Yeah. Okay, he is trustworthy and he keeps his promise. He said he would make a great nation of Ishmael, and he's showing up and saying, "I'm going to do it." Yeah. What else does it show us about God's nature that he meets them? Yeah. Right. 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 He said, God so loves the world. All means all. And God's going to make a way. And if God's people, this chosen vehicle of God's saving action, if they're going to drop the ball, God's going to pick it up. Right? Nothing, not even our disobedience, can derail God's mission. I feel that in my spirit because there have been times where I have witnessed that, or I've personally experienced that, or probably times where I've done that, right? Where I have not lived into my vocation, or when someone else hasn't lived in their vocation as God's people, and those ripple effects knock me over, and I ask the question, God, they have derailed this. Can you get it back on track? Is that even possible? And God says, always, always, always. God's promise is never on a budget. God's promise is rich beyond measure, deep beyond comprehension. The wild river that overflows its banks. It is the sun that lights the world. It is abundant and it is free even to the rejected outsider. So God hears, God sees. And he also, it's interesting, he empowers Hagar to see as well. He says, I am the God who sees. Now you see too. And she sees the well. God gives her this vision of the future. And it is the very immediate future, literally just water. But that opens the door to seeing the good future because God sees the oppressed. God hears the cry, and he makes a way for a good future. He shows himself once again to be the good future maker. And that title doesn't just apply to God's people. God is a good future maker for all of his children, even for the rejected outsider. So let's pause with the question, and I think we've already kind of answered that first one. What does this our passage teach us about who God sees and hears? We've kind of acknowledged that. God so loves the world. His mission is for all of creation. So let's look at this one. How might this reshape our community's posture toward those that we are tempted to ignore or exclude? And who might those people be in our own life, right? So think about that for a second. How might this reshape our community's posture for people that we would like to ignore for fear they will corrupt us? And who might those people be? Think for a second. How might this reshape our posture? How might this reshape? Yeah, okay. 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 Okay, so maybe we wouldn't be quite so afraid if we trusted that God's character and God's purposes are for redemption of all things, that we could live into the security of that, of God's character, right? And we have said it's hard to do that sometimes because we don't trust people's character. But if we trust God's character, yeah. What else? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, yes. Okay. Yes, so he says, how might this change our posture? Paul talks about when he is navigating that tension between the Jews and the Gentiles. He says, when I'm with the Jews, I live as a Jew. I live under the law that I might basically have social capital with them to share the gospel. But when I'm with Gentiles, I set that stuff aside and I live as they do within the bounds of his integrity. I live as they do that I might have the social capital. I might have the possibility of sharing the gospel. And that's not Paul being wishy-washy. That's Paul saying, I will contextualize myself. I will enter into a space and be present with them as they are, that I might be a blessing, that I might be a conduit for that blessing. And so a way to change our posture is to contextualize ourselves for the location, for the ministry, for the people that we're trying to reach. Right? Like, good luck ministering to, a population of people who are completely biblically illiterate, and you're out here talking about obscure passages, of Elijah versus Elisha, and you need to know the difference, and you're like, wait, who again? Right? So it can change our posture in that we adjust to the people with whom we are trying to minister. Yeah, what else? Yeah. Okay. Okay, you think that changed? Yeah, so she's saying in the past, maybe it has been more the church is like, if you will become like us, then you can be one of us, okay? And now she's like, I feel like this is changing in some places that people are more willing to say, come and belong and allow the Spirit and the community to bring you, to transform you, to bring you into a place of faithful living, right? And frankly, God gets to do that work, right? In the context of community and us as a vehicle of that, but say there is unconditional belonging as in order that you might experience that transforming power. Okay, other pivots in our posture, yeah? Okay. Yes, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. And so she says that sometimes we feel afraid of people that are so radically different from us, who have made maybe some sketchy choices. But working in a jail ministry changed that for her. It sounds like they became human to you. They were no longer what they did. They were now a person who had made some bad choices, but also who were they were suffering, right? So that's a good example of a population that might be sometimes hard to to develop that kind of relationship with? Are there other populations, and it might be different for all of our contexts, that, man, it is really hard to figure out how to be hospitable to this particular people group? Yeah? Okay. 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 Yeah. Right. And she's talking about it can be challenging to incorporate those who are deeply impoverished for some valid reasons, but sometimes it feels more clear how to help there. But sometimes on the opposite end of the spectrum, she said that the radically affluent, it's like, how do I even relate to you? And sometimes there's a different, like, a power dynamic, and like, what do you even need? Yeah, okay, that is valid. It can feel uncomfortable. Any other populations that might be like challenging? Yeah. Teens and children. Okay, so we love them and we say, like, yes, we want you to be a part of us. Yes. Also, can you be quiet? Right? Yeah, totally. Totally, yeah. Okay, any kind of spectrum with it. Sorry, what? Okay. Ooh. Yes. Okay, so we're saying politics. Hello, that's hard, right? Or money or resources. These ends can be really difficult, right? I've also thought about like people with mental illness, people on the spectrum, people that have some real challenges that we love and whatever, but also you're kind of disruptive. How do I navigate that with hospitality? I don't know, and that can be really hard sometimes. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, people we really deeply love. Also, how do we do this? That can be really challenging. So here, the promise of God is going to move forward, but not on the backs of the outsider. God's promise is going to move forward, but not on the backs of the outsider. You see, in God's economy, even the outsider is worth redeeming and worthy of rescue. And God's character requires that even as he moves the creation story forward through Abraham, those on the fringes are not forgotten. That's God's character. They are not forgotten, they are heard, and they are seen. And so God's care and concern for the oppressed and abused Hagar, it doesn't just speak to God's character, it speaks to God's purposes. Those purposes inherent in that promise that all the world will be blessed. God's abundant blessing is not on a budget. There's this old hymn that you maybe have known, but I only came across it a few years ago, that speaks to this. It says, "There is a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. There is a kindness in his justice, which is more than liberty. There is welcome for the sinner and more graces for the good. There is mercy with the Savior. There is healing in his blood." There is a wideness in God's mercy. Like, I grew up a Midwestern kid, and so when it came to bodies of water, I had pools, I had ponds, and occasionally a lake. And this was like not a great lake, this was more of a regular lake, right? A standard lake. But when I was 8, we got to go visit my grandparents out in Bremerton, Washington. And it's like right across from Seattle, right on the Puget Sound. And I was so excited. I was like, I'm going to see the ocean. It's going to be so vast and so big that I can't see the other side. And then I got there. And I don't know if you've ever been to Seattle, but Seattle is on this like really large inlet. Like, if this is Washington, it is this inlet into the state. And I could absolutely see the other side. And this was devastating. You know, I was crushed in. This is not the ocean. This is not the ocean. So my parents, bless them, they knew how important that was to me. And so they drove to this little town on the coast, Port Angeles, and as soon as the car stopped, I like leapt out of the car and ran to the beach with my 4-year-old brother, like tagging behind, and there it was. As vast as I had imagined, the ocean where I couldn't see the other side. It felt infinite and wider than my mind could comprehend. My 8-year-old heart was just like full to bursting with the wonder of it. There is a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea, and you can't see to the other side. Like strain though we might with our eyes, they will never catch a glimpse of the shore on the other side. How vast is his mercy. You see, in our story today with Sarah, she did not understand that vastness or that richness or that depth, because to her, God's promise was on a budget. It was like a farm pond, murky and small, with something that maybe couldn't be trusted to be adequate. And Hagar, on the other end, had no expectations of God's provisions, and yet she is plunged into the waters of God's immeasurable mercy. And so we have to ask ourselves, where does this story find a home in us today? You see, the call of the gospel for us today is different than it has been. Like, in one sense, yes, this calls us to hope in the character of God, who is El Roi, who sees me. He is God who is Ishmael, the God who hears me. And it's a reminder that even if we have been cast aside and we find ourselves on the outside of the fence looking in, that we are not forgotten, and we can be assured that God sees and hears us and is making a good future for us outsiders. But there is more to be said, because a lot of us in the room, myself included, are more like Sarah than we want to admit. I am the churchiest of church kids, my friends. I am a fourth-generation Nazarene. I was a darn good quizzer in my time. Proud caravan graduate with the Phineas Epper's Award. Guys, my dog is named Phineas, okay? I have been blessed with gifts beyond measure, with godly parents and a godly heritage and churches that have loved me, and a Christian higher education and even seminary. Like, I am the most insidery of insiders. And so I think I'm going to skip that next question because we've already kind of answered it. The question is, as an insidery insider, and maybe you too, how have I participated in that budget mindset? How have I somehow bought into this lie that by embracing the wideness of God's mercy, that somehow I will allow God's promise to be sullied, as if I had that power, right? And so how does recognizing the wideness in God's mercy challenge us to think differently about mission and hospitality? Like, am I taking all the gifts I've been given, all the promises, all the mercies, all these acts of love, and am I stacking them against the door that I might lose what's mine, or lest I or my kids or our community somehow be corrupted by the outsider? Have I taken on the role of gatekeeper, rationing out God's mercy and as if they were on a budget, as if I had a limited number of coupons? Have I forgotten there is a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea? Have we on occasion lost sight that we too have been blessed to be a blessing? We have been grafted into Abraham's family, into God's story. And so that means that not only the promise applies to us of God's provision, but also the mission. I'm not just saved from sin, I have been saved for mission. Hospitality to the outsider, to demonstrate, to embody with my character and my choices of the wideness of God's mercy. And so this is our last question. How does God's concern for Hagar and Ishmael model the kind of community that we are called to be? And I would say, how does God's concern for Isaac, or for Ishmael and Hagar and Isaac, for the insider and the outsider, how does that model the kind of community that we are called to be? And kind of that second question, let's integrate it into that. What specific steps can we take as a group or as a person or as a congregation to make sure that our blessing is never a barrier, but is an invitation? Okay? So how can we model God's character in our community? And what does that practically look like, that our blessing is never a barrier, but is an invitation? Think for a second. Pause. We have a minute. Think for a second. Think about your church, your neighborhood, your community. Sorry. So how does God's action in the story, how does it model the kind of, how does it model the kind of community that we are called to be? What does that look like? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yes. How deep and how wide. Okay. Right. So he is describing part of how we can model that is by living into the promise of abundance, right? That there is always enough in God's economy, like though how wide and how deep and how far, how all the things, right? That we can live in, he described it as living in the overflow of living into that promise of abundance. And that requires, like we talked about, Sarah received the promise and yet she immediately pivoted to that like hoarding mindset. And so that tells us that not only just this one moment in time, but we need to cultivate a character that chooses abundance, right? That believes the promise of abundance. We cultivate our character through practices together. Yes, yeah. Okay. Right. 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 So she talks about like getting out into the community to discern needs, discern how we can be present, to discern how we can embody God's abundance in very practical ways, right? In order to be a blessing. Yeah, getting out. Yeah, right back there. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yep. Right. Right. So you're saying what I'm hearing you say is it's not just about abundance of stuff, like, okay, they need this thing, let's meet the need. Wow, we have been the blessing. But in addition to an abundance of, support, an abundance of presence, an abundance of community, an abundance of hospitality, and saying it's not just about giving you stuff, it's about coming to know you well, coming to integrate you, coming to say that you are welcome and you belong. That's so good. Yeah.
Not just the community of the church and God, but your own community. We started a block party last year,
Yeah.
and everyone around we invite in
Yeah.
the yard. We have found neighbors that live next to us don't even know each other. How many people know anybody a block away from you?
Right. Okay.
You go to your own community right there in your own neighborhood
Right.
and talk to them,
Yeah.
get to know them so you can invite them.
Right. It's interesting, like, we live in a culture that is increasingly isolated, right? And that was even before COVID, because we can connect, by sitting in our own room, like we are less inclined to engage our neighbor. And so by that block party, that kind of this like corporate gathering, not only they were coming to know you guys, they were coming to know one another. And so by modeling that intentional connection, you were helping others kind of reawaken to that need. Yeah. Any other things as we're wrapping up? Just 1 second, just 1 second. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Right. Right. So this person isn't just a need. This person isn't just a task. This person isn't just something on our checklist because we're supposed to do it because we're good people. This is a person with whom we want to cultivate intimacy. Like not just giving you a thing, but embracing you, whether it's literally or metaphorically, right? Yeah. 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 Right, because it's an investment, not just of stuff, but of our life. Like it requires that I adjust my schedule accordingly. Yeah, because I say yes to one thing, it means saying no to something else, typically. Yeah.
To remember where we came from.
Okay.
Can't use that
Ooh, yes. Yes, she said you have to remember where we came from and not just say, well, look where I am. Don't you want to come here? Okay, that is a really interesting part of the Nazarene identity because when we started, we were radically engaged with the poor and the sick and the outsider and the unwed mothers like, oh my gosh, the scandal, okay? And so these people come in and their lives are transformed. And within a generation or two, we have these people that are living these beautiful lives of holiness, but now they have distanced themselves, well, for good reason, from that particular lifestyle. But it's very easy to look down and say, I can't believe you're doing that, and forget from what we have been delivered, right? Although I will say, as a churchy kid, like there was this song that I heard one time, it was like, I don't have a testimony. I don't have this dramatic story being delivered from crack, I don't. But I do have stories of deliverance from pride and from fear and from that works righteousness, that panic that I'm not enough. Like there have been ways that I've been delivered too. And perhaps we should invite the Spirit to reveal that to us instead of saying, well, I've always been a Christian. But like truly engaging is like, from what has the Lord delivered me and how might I hold that near to my heart, that might help continue to cultivate a spirit of empathy, right, for the other. Now, we are out of time. But thanks be to God, this is a challenging word for us to engage this morning. But thank you for your faithfulness, and may the Lord bless the hearing of this word and bring forth change within us. So have a good day.